Say that right there is the magic of what I've been, it's been such a pleasure being part of with you for these last 2 months or so, that you're giving people a little bit of all of these people know something's not right. The information we're getting is not right. The language we're speaking is not right. The way we're talking about government is not right. Everything that Eric just said right there. And you're giving them a little room every day to figure it out for themselves.
Well, I mean, maybe there's two things that are happening. One is because of the long form, it's actually possible to have more in-depth discussions about these things. And the other is that because my lectures, let's say, and the discussions that I've been having focus on the development of ideas rather than on the ideas themselves, that gives people a bit of breathing space. One of the questions that I'm really curious about is, and I'd like to know what you think about this, is what do you think it is that's fundamentally driving the radicalness of the left? Like what? Because it does seem so counterproductive, even to the left's own stated positions, you know, because when I was in Aspen, for example, I talked about the literature on biological differences between men and women in psychology, right? It's like mostly men and women are similar, even in the dimensions where they differ most, there's way more overlap than there is difference, right? So aggression is a good example of that. So if you take a random man and a random woman out of the population and you had to bet on who was the more aggressive, if you bet on the man, you'd be right 60% of the time. But that's not that much. But then all the actions at the tails, right? So you don't care about how aggressive the average person is, you care about how aggressive the really aggressive people are, and they're all male, and so you end up putting them in prison, which accounts for the massive differential between men and women in prison rates. And so you can have small differences at the mean and radical differences at the extremes. So, and that's the fact that people don't understand that is partly willful blindness on the part of the ideologically committed, but also partly because it's somewhat complex statistically. But then I think about the audience that I was addressing at Aspen. They weren't happy about me talking about biological differences in personality between men and women. And I thought, well, what the hell do you want exactly from your leftist perspective? Is like, why is it so necessary for you to make the presumption that there cannot be any differences whatsoever between men and women? It's like, well, first of all, there are, so that's a big problem for your theory, but why all of a sudden has this become an axiomatic position of the left that these differences can't exist, when what you want to do in principle is free up people to make choices, I think, that are to make choices in a market that would allow for those choices in keeping with their intrinsic nature. Like, why did that? I don't understand why that shifted.
And what's interesting is you're talking about the intellectual liberal elite. That's the type of people you were talking in front of, right? It's not that you were, it's not that you were just talking in front of just a group of lefties or a group of righties or anything else.
No.
You were talking about, you know, the primo
This is the commentariat.
Yeah, right, exactly.
All right.
So what do you do with that?
Well, let me come straight at it. We on the left had an idea that if we could get rid of cultural bias in IQ testing, if we could get rid of misogyny that was structural in the workplace, that we would get a particular kind of outcome. And we did make things better in many ways, but it didn't go as far as we were expecting. And so this is what people are wrestling with. And you know, I hesitate to call it this, but I think it's the most powerful way of saying it. It's the great oppression shortage of 2018. And the problem is that there still is structural oppression. I mean, look at Robert Moses's design of New York City's highways, bridges, and byways, famously trying to keep buses from going to Jones Beach. I guess, is it Jones Beach?
Yeah, no, to Jones Beach. He literally, I mean, I grew up on Long Island. The bridges going over the LIE at that area are lower because they didn't want buses bringing people from the inner city.
The bridge spills out into Harlem so that it doesn't affect real estate prices somewhere else on the east side. So, you know, there really is structural oppression the way there was when there were literacy tests for voting, which were constructed so that no black person could pass because it was impossible. Okay, but there's less of it now, and there's not enough of it to explain some of the differences. And the great fear is that the left program to try to produce better representation, better opportunities for women, for minorities, whatever, is going to stall out if we start to think of these things as differences. So
okay, so why is it a problem if, okay, fair enough. Why is it a problem if it stalls out, though? Is it because there's all sorts of radical activists who then don't have anything to do, or is there a deeper problem?
That's part of it. That's what you're seeing with the Southern Poverty Law Center.
Oh, yes.
Which is that you have an institution that fundamentally accomplished much of its mission, but then it still had a large kitty and idle hands.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And
sounds like humanities departments to me.
Right. Okay, and we can get to that.
Yeah.
But I also want to steelman the other position so that you have something to fight against or to wrestle with. If I think about, I do something different with women in the workplace with respect to trying to figure out what is unfair to them, because there are things that are very unfair to them. And one of the things I do is to say, tell me about the great ideas of females and the great contributions that are sitting there on the table, in part because they had a female discoverer, right? So you could look at Vera Rubin's work in which never got a Nobel Prize. Everybody knows about it in astrophysics. But I went through one of these things with my wife, where we did this thing with gauge theory and economics in the Harvard economics department. And I think it was one of the most sensational breakthroughs in mathematical and bedrock economic theory in the last 25 years. And just be very clear. Every time people want to figure out how to tax Americans more and cut their benefits without paying the price of touching the so-called third rails of politics, they realize that the CPI indexes both tax receipts and entitlements, so payments like Social Security and Medicare. And if you can show that the CPI is overstated, then the idea is that you get to take in more tax revenue and you get to pay old people and sick people less. And so it's a very popular game in Washington.
To gerrymander the measurement.
To gerrymander the measurement. Now, the two ways that you do that, one is that you go from a fixed basket where you have, let's say, basketballs and glasses, and you figure out what the price of that basket is over time, to something which is, what is the utility? So the idea is, maybe I want slightly more glasses or basketball. You could do it with coffee and tea. I'm willing to trade off some amount of coffee for some amount of tea to get my caffeine fix if there's a problem or a bumper crop in Brazil. Okay. The other thing you do is that you keep updating these baskets, and that's called chaining. Mm-hmm. Well, you can't do both of those things together because there's a presumed impossibility result that you can't have a true chain cost of living index, except that my wife and I solved that problem in the mid-1990s, at the same time that the Boston Commission was trying to back out an exact 1.1% overstatement, because that would save $1 trillion. So in other words, you have to understand, they were given the task, go find a 1.1% overstatement and justify it so that we can cut benefits and raise taxes. And my wife got in the middle of that bank robbery as it was being attempted, and so she got thwacked. Now, I wanted to fight these sons of bitches. Absolutely. In particular, there's a professor named Dale Jorgensen who spearheaded the attempt to really crush her when she was getting her dissertation. This is great work. And the cost of it, Jordan, is that there's great work done by women that is sitting there because fundamentally the women don't want to fight the way you and I would fight for our work, because it's not necessarily fun. It's unpleasant. And with me, I have a very aggressive response to this. It's like, how dare you talk about my work? Do you know how much better my work is than your work? And let's do this. Now,
that's a complicated thing too, because for a piece of brilliant work to rise up to the point where it's universally acclaimed, it takes a lot more than merely the brilliant work. It's like putting a product out into the marketplace, like a consumer product. You might have a brilliant product, but the fact that you have a brilliant product is about 5% of what you need to have a successful product, because the rest of it is sales and marketing. And then if so, you might say, there's many ideas that we haven't taken stock of that we should have taken stock of. Those that we have taken stock of are this weird combination of brilliant idea plus brilliant and forceful marketing plus luck.
All right.
And so if it's the case, for example, that because women are less assertive, they're less likely to fight those ideas forward, although equally likely to generate as many brilliant ideas, then that's going to cause a decrement in their movement forward. And we need to contend with that.
Well, that's what I'm trying to say, which is that fundamentally the reason I ask for, don't tell me about the women being suppressed, tell me about the ideas of women so I can I can use my aggression. As long as we have a male-dominated system, you have men who want to fight for great ideas. It's good.
Well, but then the question is, do we have a male-dominated system, or do we have a dominance-dominated system?
Right.
Well, so this is
right.
Let me tease this apart. I have been in, I think, 5 almost all male fields. I've touched mathematics, theoretical physics, economics, finance, and tech. And they're not all male, but they're male-dominated fields. One of those fields I found had a cancerous attitude towards women that was just visible. So I got a chance to see in finance all of the bad behavior that people talked about the objectification, about locker room talk, which was just absolutely natural. Not in every context, but it was often enough. In the other fields in general, like in math, I don't think I ever heard people making nasty comments about women. So in the same weird way, it's not like I'm deaf to it, because I can hear it in one case. I didn't hear it very often in the other case. In physics, I didn't hear many nasty comments about women, but it was incredible. Particle theory, for a period of time, was incredibly aggressive. Like labor economics was super aggressive. Symplectic geometry inside of math was super female friendly. So there is definitely this difference in texture between these different places in male-dominated fields. And having seen relatively benign male-dominated fields and hyper-toxic male-dominated fields, I can tell you that I don't love going into a particle theory seminar where everybody's peacocking, because it's relatively uninteresting relative to the work.
Well, you would say to some degree that would indicate that the system has become somewhat corrupt in the ways that systems can be corrupt, and that what's pushing you forward in those fields is less about competence and more about, let's say, dominance.
I don't know.
Well, I don't know either, but you could generate that as a hypothesis. But I'll tell you, one of the things our psychometric work has revealed, this is quite interesting, is when we've looked at differences in men and women with regards to outcome and then controlled for personality.
Right.
The personality differences almost always obliterate the gender differences, which means it's actually not a gender difference, it's a personality difference.
Okay, but let's flip that, because this is...
It isn't always the case.
No, I understand that. So I think that that's very important, but now you're going to get...
Because I could say then the ideas of agreeable men in these fields might be as likely to be pushed
totally
to the
agree
side.
with you. I totally agree with you. Now, here's the next part of it. Many... Let's not do it as male-female. Many agreeable people have the idea that the problem is that the fields are so tilted towards disagreeability. Now, I don't happen to believe this. That we are losing good ideas because agreeable people can't make progress. And in those circumstances, the claim isn't, let's just have an open competition and see what rises to the top. It's, let's change the structure of things. Now, this...
Okay, so there's a problem with that. So let me point out another psychometric problem with that. Okay. If you look at what predicts success in workplaces, generally what predicts is IQ and conscientiousness. Agreeableness is a very trivial predictor. Now, one of the things you do see is that agreeable people tend to get paid less for the same work. But we don't know why that is exactly. We don't know if they don't bargain as well. I think that's the simplest explanation, is that it's easier to take advantage of agreeable people. It's almost like the definition of agreeable. It's the downside of being agreeable. But agreeableness is not a very good predictor of workplace success. There's actually a corrupt literature that's associated with this, because there's a whole literature on emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence puts you ahead in the workplace. It's like, no, it doesn't. Emotional intelligence is almost indiscriminable from trait agreeableness. And trait agreeableness actually puts you behind especially in the managerial domain. Now you might say, well, that means the managerial domain is prejudiced against agreeable people. But then there's some evidence that disagreeable people make better managers. And the reason for that is that they can't be pushed around. Because, if you're a manager, you might say, well, what you have to do is you have to deal with the concerns of your employees. And that would be the agreeable interpretation. But sometimes if you're a manager, you have to take the slackers and give them hell. And that's something that only a disagreeable person can do.
Well, this is the thing.
But there isn't much evidence on the psychometric front that agreeableness that agreeableness is a major contributor to workplace success in general. So it isn't obvious to me from the psychometric work that the idea that hierarchies in general are contaminated by a preference for disagreeable people. I don't see any evidence for that.
Well, look, part of the problem with this whole discussion is that there are roles in which agreeability works. You can have a team where you need a certain balance of these things.
Yes, it probably works for customer service, for example, to be agreeable.
Right.
And
so,
maybe for care of people.
So all of these things, I mean, the world didn't come up with big 5 traits and distribute us across them if they don't have advantages. Like,
right.
Are you
Absolutely.
colorblind?
No, but my father is, and he can see animals in the bush better than me.
That's what I was going to make the point, is that from my perspective, you're contrast blind.
Right.
Right? And the idea is that when I'm talking about this, that strikes color normal people as very strange way. Well, that's a strange way to look at the world. But the fact is that these traits are retained because they have different uses. Now,
yes, that's right. That is the fact.
If you focus on the right tail of the distribution, the extreme right tail, if you hang out with billionaires, very often, in order to get to billionaire status, you have to be able to oppose large numbers of people and say they're all wrong and I'm right.
And then you also have to be right.
And you have to be right.
That helps.
Which is even worse, right? You have to be right and you have to be disagreeable.
That's absolutely right. But if I look at some of the things that my friend Peter Thiel can do, that I find very few people can, it's like, can you hold a position, even if you know 2 years from now you're going to be proven right, with 2 years of scorn?
Yeah.
The average person is going to crumble.
Yeah, well, and that would also be partly trait neuroticism, is that people have to be able to tolerate that level of stress. And that's very, very difficult.
And this is what I'm trying to get at, which is that people are looking at various reward structures, and they're saying, well, that doesn't match my particular set of traits, and I feel that my traits are valuable, and those traits probably are valuable, but we are not all destined to become Beyonce or Peter Thiel or Jordan Peterson.
But what seems to be happening, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. But what seems to be happening, I think, like if you look at the Scandinavian countries, the more egalitarian Scandinavian countries, that's where you're getting the most radical assortment of occupational status by gender. And so I would say, for example, that if you tilt towards agreeableness, which is actually a pretty good predictor of interest in people rather than interest in things, the biggest difference between men and women seems to be in interest.
Right.
Men are reliably more interested in things and women more reliably interested in people. The difference is 1 standard deviation. So it's a big difference.
Right.
And what seems to be happening in the Scandinavian countries is people are sorting themselves by their temperament, which is what they should do, because your temperament, as you just pointed out, predisposes you to success in some realm and not in others, right? You don't get both.
And failure.
And failure. So because women are on average more agreeable and perhaps higher in negative emotion, it isn't obvious how that fits into the equation. They're more sensitive to the distress of others and more likely to be compassionate in their care. So what happens? You open up the landscape of competitiveness to women, they immediately dominate the healthcare fields. And that's exactly what's happened. Now, part of the problem with that is that healthcare as an occupation doesn't scale well, like engineering does, for example, and so it's very difficult to generate large fortunes in healthcare, and that's one of the things that skews the gender distribution of wealth. But it looks like if we left people be, to the degree that we can, they would sort themselves into occupations by temperament, and that might be the best solution for everyone.
It's a question of, like, when we had our first child, we had a practice where there was a rotation of the OBGYN who'd deliver. We had this one woman who we were totally on the same page with. We loved her. Everything about her was fantastic. We were simpatico. And my wife's labor went on and on and on and on. Supposedly we were getting closer and closer. Finally, this woman couldn't take it anymore, and she said, I got to go to sleep. And the guy that we dreaded, the 6'4" guy with the bow tie, who came from a totally different era, we called him the Undertaker, comes in and he says, she's completely blown where we are in the process. You're barely dilated at all. We need to deliver this child immediately via cesarean. It's like, huh? What?
Right.
Well, this son of a bitch saved the situation for my wife and my daughter.
Yep.
And the idea is, I didn't like him one bit.
Absolutely, man. That happens.
And that guy
the woman who diagnosed our daughter with arthritis, same thing. I was really mad at her. Really mad at her. She was very disagreeable, and she was right.
And let's be very clear.
Compassion and right are not the same thing.
This is the thing. The reason that we didn't have flipper babies for thalidomide commonly in the United States was one woman who I think went to the University of Chicago at like 16, and she stood up and said, I don't like the data on this drug, and I don't think you drug companies have done enough to prove to me that this is safe to prescribe to pregnant women. And she just put up her hand and stopped it. Now, I don't know what I'm going to use son of a bitch. That son of a bitch saved how many? I mean, she's a national hero,
right.
and we should be celebrating.
Yeah,
But the issue is that it's not down to healthcare, agreeable or disagreeable. The problem is that we now have so much information about ourselves and about the occupations and the reward structures, and there is a lot of structural unfairness, and there is a lot of unfairness about here's your endowment, and you were given different gifts, and then there's a certain amount of luck. That we are all struggling with the idea that we have so much information and not enough oppression to explain this, and we're not necessarily happy with the outcome. We don't necessarily want to have an honest conversation about it.